There is a throne sitting empty in a palace in Babylon. It is not the main throne. It is a smaller one, set off to the side, the kind you give to a guest you are keeping an eye on. And for 37 years, the man it belongs to has not been sitting on it. He has been in a prison cell across the city, in the dark, wearing the same clothes he was captured in as a teenager. He was a king once. He ruled for 3 months and 10 days before the soldiers came. Now he is an old man who has almost forgotten what a table feels like under his hands. Hold on to that empty throne. We are going to come back to it, because the very last thing the Bible says about the kings of Israel and Judah is not a battle, and it is not a funeral, and it is not what you would expect at all. But to understand why that throne matters, you have to go back 400 years. You have to go back to the beginning of a list that God himself keeps, a scorecard that almost nobody talks about. Here is what most people miss. When you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, you are not really reading a history of politics. You are reading a report card. 42 names go by. Some rule for 40 years. One rules for 7 days. And next to almost every single name, the same divine record keeper writes the same verdict over and over until it starts to feel like a drumbeat you cannot get out of your head. The Hebrew word is ra. We translate it evil, but ra means more than a bad mood or a bad decision. It means ruin. It means the thing that actively tears down and destroys. He did ra in the eyes of the Lord. He did ra in the eyes of the Lord. He did ra in the eyes of the Lord. King after king after king. And every so often, rarely, so rarely you start to lean in, when it happens, the verdict flips. A different word appears. Yasher. It means straight, upright, like a wall that holds true to the plumb line. He did yasher in the eyes of the Lord. You could count the kings who earned that word on your fingers and have some left over. 42 kings for 100 years, and a nation trying, over and over, to get one thing right, to find one man who could carry the weight of the crown the way it was meant to be carried. 42 attempts, 42 failures, and then chains and a burning city and that empty throne in Babylon. This is not a story about politics. This is not a story about thrones. This is not a story about a small nation that lost a war to a bigger one. This is a story about what happens when human beings are handed the one job they were never strong enough to do, and about the strange, quiet promise that refuses to die even when every king who was supposed to carry it has failed. So let's walk the list. All of it. The good kings you have never heard of. The monster who was born to one of the best fathers in the Bible. The woman who murdered her own grandchildren to steal a throne. The boy who became king at 8 years old and found a book that broke his heart. And at the very end, a man in a prison cell and a throne standing empty, waiting. It starts with the wisest king who ever lived, and the day God told him it was all going to fall apart. Solomon had everything. He had wisdom the whole world came to hear. He had gold coming in by the ton. He had a temple, so beautiful that a foreign queen took one look at it and said the half had not been told to her. If there was ever a king who could carry the crown the way it was meant to be carried, it should have been this one. The son of David, the wisest man alive, and he threw it away for love of the wrong things. He married hundreds of women from nations God had told him to stay away from, and one by one they turned his heart. He built shrines to their gods on the hills around Jerusalem, to Ashtoreth, to Chemosh, to Molech, the one they fed children to. The wisest man alive built altars to a god of burning babies on a hill overlooking the temple of the living God. Read that again slowly. Wisdom is not the same thing as faithfulness. You can know everything and still lose your heart an inch at a time. So God spoke to him, and the words are some of the heaviest in the whole book. Because you have done this and have not kept my covenant, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. But, and hold on to this word, because the entire rest of the story hangs on it. For the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days. I will tear it from the hand of your son, yet I will not tear away all of it. I will give one tribe to your son, for the sake of David my servant. For the sake of David. Remember that. It is the thread that runs under everything. God is not making a promise to Solomon here. Solomon has already lost that. He is making a promise to a dead man, to David, and he intends to keep it long, after every living king has forgotten it. Tuck that away. You will need it at the end. Solomon died, and the crown passed to his son Rehoboam, and this is where you can feel the whole nation holding its breath. Because Solomon's kingdom had been built on the backs of the people. The palaces, the temple, the fleet of ships, the stables full of horses, someone paid for all of it, in taxes and in forced labor. And the north had carried the heaviest share. So when Rehoboam came up to be crowned, the people sent a man to speak for them, and it was not just anyone. It was Jeroboam, the very man Solomon had once tried to kill, back from hiding in Egypt. And the request was simple and fair. Your father laid a heavy yoke on us. Lighten it, just a little, and we will serve you gladly all your days. Give me 3 days, Rehoboam said. Come back in 3 days, and I will answer. And in those 3 days, he did something that looks wise on the surface. He asked for advice. First he went to the old men, the ones who had stood in the room, with his father, who had watched Solomon rule for 40 years. And they told him the thing that every leader needs to hear, and almost none want to. Be a servant to these people today, they said. Answer them gently, give them good words, and they will be your servants forever. Then Rehoboam walked out of that room and asked his friends instead, the young men he had grown up with, who had never carried a burden or built a palace, who had only ever known him as the prince. And they told him what young power always wants to hear. Show them who is in charge. Tell them your little finger is thicker than your father's waist. 3 days later the people came back for their answer. And here it gets stranger, because the wisest father in the history of the world produced a son with no wisdom at all. Rehoboam ignored the old men. He stood in front of his people and said the words that split the kingdom in two. My father made your yoke heavy. I will add to it. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. The reaction was instant. 10 of the 12 tribes turned their backs and walked out, shouting the words that would echo for 400 years. What portion do we have in David? To your tents, O Israel. They walked north and made a man named Jeroboam their king. And just like that, there were 2 kingdoms where there had been one. In the north, 10 tribes, keeping the name Israel. In the south, 2 tribes clinging to Jerusalem and the temple and the line of David, taking the name Judah. 2 capitals, 2 crowns, 2 separate lists of kings running side by side for the next few centuries, and you are going to need to hold both in your head at once. But here's the thing to watch. From this day forward, next to nearly every name on both lists, that same record keeper picks up the pen. R.A. Evil. Or, once in a great while, Yasher. Straight. The scorecard has begun, and the first king of the north is about to commit the sin that every king after him will inherit. Jeroboam had a problem, and it kept him up at night. He was king of the north now, 10 tribes. But the temple was in the south, in Jerusalem, in Judah, and 3 times a year every faithful Israelite was supposed to travel there to worship. Jeroboam did the math. If his people keep walking south to Jerusalem, he thought, sooner or later their hearts will follow. They will remember they belong to the house of David, and they will kill me and go back. So he made a decision that would poison the north for 200 years. He made 2 golden calves. He set one up in the far north, at a town called Dan, and one in the south of his kingdom, at Bethel. And he stood in front of his people and said the words, It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is almost word for word what Aaron said at the foot of Mount Sinai, when he made the first golden calf, while Moses was still up on the mountain. Jeroboam did not invent a new sin. He reached back and pulled the oldest one off the shelf and handed it to a whole nation, because it was politically convenient. And from that day, the record keeper has a phrase for the north. Not just he did evil, something more specific. He walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin, which he made Israel to sin. That line, or something close to it, gets stamped on nearly every northern king who follows. Jeroboam became the standard for corruption. To be compared to him was the worst thing the record could say. Now watch what happens next, because the throne of the north turns into something you would not wish on anyone. Down in the south, in Judah, the crown passes quietly, from father to son, generation after generation, because the line of David holds. But in the north there is no such promise. There is only ambition. And so the throne of Israel becomes a chair that men kill to sit in and then die in, over and over. Jeroboam's son Nadab took over and lasted about 2 years. He was out, with the army, laying siege to a Philistine town, when one of his own men, a soldier named Baasha, struck him down in front of the whole camp and took the crown off his head. And Baasha did not just kill the king. He went back and wiped out the entire family. Every descendant of Jeroboam, every child, every heir, gone in a single purge, exactly as a prophet named Ahijah had warned would happen. The golden calves had bought Jeroboam a kingdom and cost him his entire bloodline. But here is the pattern, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Baasha climbed to the throne on a massacre, and then did the very same evil as the man he replaced. He walked in the way of Jeroboam. So a prophet came to Baasha too, with the very same sentence: your house will end the way you began. Baasha died in his bed, but his son Elah inherited the curse. Elah lasted barely 2 years, and he did not even die on a battlefield. He was in the capital, in the house of the man who managed his palace, drinking himself senseless. And while he sat there drunk, one of his own officials, a commander of half the royal chariots, a man named Zimri, walked in and killed him. And then Zimri did what Baasha had done. He hunted down every last member of Elah's family until not one was left alive. Zimri took the crown, and I want you to hold on to how long he kept it. 7 days. 7 days. Because when the army out in the field heard that Zimri had murdered the king, they refused him. Right there in the war camp, they crowned their own commander instead, a hardened general named Omri, and the whole army turned around and marched home to take the capital by force. Zimri stood on the walls and watched an entire army coming for him, and he understood there was no throne left to defend and nowhere to run. So he walked back into the palace he had held for 1 week, into the innermost stronghold of the king's house, and he set the building on fire around himself, and he burned to death inside it. 7 days a king, then ashes and smoke rising over Samaria. Omri stepped over the wreckage and took the crown. And here is one of the strangest things in the whole list. By the world's measure, Omri was the north's most successful king. He built a brand new capital city, Samaria, on a hill he bought for 2 talents of silver. He was such a force that for 100 years afterward the Assyrians called the entire kingdom the House of Omri, long after his family was gone. And the Bible gives him 8 verses. 8. Because the record God keeps does not score the way empires score. It does not care how many cities you built or how much silver you moved. It measures one thing. And of Omri it says he did more evil than all who were before him. All that success bought him almost no ink at all, which tells you exactly what this scorecard is really measuring, and it is not greatness. But Omri had a son, and the son was about to make everyone before him look mild. His name was Ahab. And the record keeper, who has already called 4 or 5 men the most evil king yet, finally runs out of room. Of Ahab it simply says he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than all who were before him. He is the bottom of the northern list, and a great deal of that is because of the woman he married. Her name was Jezebel. She was not an Israelite. She was a princess of Sidon, up on the Phoenician coast, the daughter of a king, who was also a priest of Baal. When she came south to marry Ahab, she did not leave her gods at the border. She brought them with her, and she brought her will with her, and she was a far stronger person than her husband. And so, for the first time, the north did not just drift from God. It made war on him. Jezebel set out to erase the worship of the Lord entirely. She put Baal's prophets on the royal payroll, hundreds of them, fed at her own table. And she began hunting down the prophets of the living God and killing them, one after another, until the man who was supposed to speak for God in Israel had to hide in caves to stay alive. Picture that. A whole nation, founded on the God who split the sea, and now its queen is executing anyone who dares to speak his name. The lights are going out across Israel, one prophet at a time. And into that darkness God sent one man. Not an army. One man, from nowhere, with a rough cloak and a name. That was itself a sermon. Elijah. The name means, "The Lord is my God," which was the exact question the whole nation had stopped being able to answer. Elijah walked into Ahab's court and announced there would be no rain. Not a drop. Not until he said so. And then he vanished, and for 3.5 years the land dried up and cracked, and the crops failed, and the great King Ahab could do absolutely nothing about it. Spend all the silver you want. Pray to Baal, the storm god, the rain god, as loud as you like. The sky stays shut. Then, after 3 years, Elijah came back, and he threw down a challenge. That is one of the great scenes in the entire Bible. "Bring everyone," he said. "Bring all of Israel to the top of Mount Carmel. Bring your 450 prophets of Baal. And let's settle this once and for all, in front of everybody." Stay with me, because the way he framed it is the whole point. He stood in front of the crowd and asked one question. How long will you go limping between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. The people said nothing, not a word. That silence is the sound of a nation that no longer knows what it believes. So Elijah set the terms. 2 altars, 2 bulls, no fire lit by human hands. You call on your God, I call on mine. And the God, who answers by fire, he is God. The prophets of Baal went first. They called on their God, from morning until noon. Nothing. They danced around the altar. Nothing. They shouted louder, and they cut themselves, with swords and spears, until the blood ran down, screaming for a God who would not answer. And Elijah, and you have to love this, stood there and mocked them. Cry louder, he called out. Maybe your God is deep in thought. Maybe he is busy. Maybe he is on a journey. Maybe he is asleep, and someone needs to wake him up. From morning to evening they raved, and the heavens stayed silent as stone. Then Elijah rebuilt the broken altar of the Lord, with 12 stones, one for each tribe, north and south together, as if to say, you are still one people, whether you remember it or not. He laid the wood. He laid the bull. And then he did something that makes no sense, unless you are absolutely certain of your God. He had them drench the whole thing in water. Once, twice, a third time, until it filled the trench around the altar. And he prayed one short prayer. No screaming, no dancing, just, Lord, let it be known today that you are God, and that I am your servant, and that you are turning these hearts back again. And the fire fell. It fell from the sky and consumed the bull, the wood, the stones, the dust, and it licked up every drop of water in the trench. And the whole nation fell on their faces in the dirt and cried out the thing they had been too afraid to say. The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. For one blazing moment, the answer came back. But hold that moment carefully. Because a nation can watch fire fall from heaven and still, within a generation, walk right back to the calves. And that is exactly what the North was about to do. Now, before we cross into the second half of this, take a breath and look at how far we have come. One kingdom, torn into two. A southern line clinging to a promise made to David. A northern line that cannot go 10 years without a coup. Chained to a golden calf it refuses to give up, sinking so low that God has to send fire from the sky just to get its attention. And we are not even halfway through the list. If you are still here, if you are the kind of person who wants the whole picture and not just the highlight reel, do me one small favor. Subscribe so the rest of this finds its way back to you. And leave one word in the comments right now, the name of the king, so far who has surprised you the most. I read them, because the second half is where the whole thing turns, and you are not going to want to miss how it ends. Now, back to the north, and to the bloodiest cleanup in the Bible. Ahab was gone, but his house was not. His sons ruled after him, and his widow Jezebel was still alive, still powerful, still bowing to Baal in the palace at Samaria. The rod had a family now, and God decided the family was going to end. So he chose an instrument. Not a prophet this time. A soldier, a chariot commander named Jehu, a man known for one thing above all others. He drove like a lunatic. The watchmen on the walls could recognize him from a distance by the way his chariot came on, furious, reckless, faster than any sane man would drive. God had a prophet secretly anoint this man king and give him a single mission: wipe out the house of Ahab. All of it. Every heir, every idol, every priest of Baal. Finish what Carmel started. And Jehu did it, with a cold efficiency that is genuinely frightening to read. He drove straight to the palace. The reigning king of the north came out to meet him, along with the visiting king of the south, and Jehu shot the northern king through the heart with an arrow as he tried to flee. Then he rode into the city where Jezebel was waiting. She had heard he was coming. And this is the detail you never forget. She painted her eyes and fixed her hair and stood at an upper window, dressed like the queen she still believed she was, and called down a taunt at him as he rode in. Jehu did not even look up for long. He called out to the window, "Who is on my side? Who?" And 2 or 3 palace officials leaned out beside her. "Throw her down," he said. And they did. They threw the queen out of her own window, and she fell, and the horses trampled her in the courtyard, and Jehu drove his chariot over her and went inside to eat dinner. By the time anyone went to bury her, there was almost nothing left, exactly as Elijah had prophesied years before. Then Jehu turned to Ahab's 70 sons, scattered across Samaria under the care of the city's leaders. He sent a letter, a dare, really, and by the next morning the elders had sent him 70 heads in baskets, piled in 2 heaps at the city gate. Here is the part nobody tells you. Jehu was carrying out a true and just judgment God had spoken, and it was also a horror. Both things are in the text at once. Sometimes the Bible refuses to let you feel clean about the justice you were rooting for. Finally, he went after Baal himself. Jehu pretended to be an even greater worshiper of Baal than Ahab had been. He announced a massive festival, summoned every prophet and priest of Baal in the land into the temple, packed the building wall to wall, and then sealed the doors and sent in 80 men with swords. In one afternoon, he ended organized Baal worship in the north. He tore the temple down and turned the site into a latrine. And after all of that, after the arrows and the window and the baskets and the sword, the record keeper picks up the pen and writes the most deflating line imaginable. Jehu destroyed Baal. But Jehu did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, the golden calves that were at Bethel and at Dan. Even God's own executioner, the man who scoured Baal out of Israel with fire and blood, would not let go of the convenient sin. He killed the foreign god and kept the homemade one. That is the tragedy of the north in one man. You can hate the sin that came from outside and still cling to the sin that feels like home. Jehu's family held the throne for 4 generations. After that, longer than any other dynasty in the north, and it produced the most successful reign the northern kingdom ever saw. A king named Jeroboam II, not the first Jeroboam with the calves, his namesake, generations later. And under this second Jeroboam, Israel boomed. He pushed the borders out farther than they had been since Solomon. Trade poured in. The wealthy built summer houses and winter houses and beds inlaid with ivory. From the outside, it looked like a golden age. It looked like God was blessing them at last. But God saw underneath it. And in those very years he raised up a shepherd named Amos, a rough man, from the south, with dirt under his nails, and sent him north to say what no one wanted to hear. All this prosperity, Amos said, is built on the backs of the poor. You sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. You trample the head of the poor into the dust, and then you go to worship and sing your songs as if God is pleased. And Amos delivered the line that still rings like a struck bell. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. The golden age was gold on the surface and wrought underneath, and the scorecard was not fooled. Jeroboam II, richest and strongest king the north ever had, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. The clock on the northern kingdom was almost out of time. To understand how the north ended, you have to understand who was standing on its border. Assyria. And Assyria was not like any enemy Israel had faced before. The Assyrians had built the most terrifying war machine the ancient world had ever seen. They did not just conquer nations. They erased them. Their method was deportation on a massive scale. When they took a people, they ripped them out of their land, marched them hundreds of miles into foreign territory, and scattered them among other conquered peoples, so they could never reorganize, never rebel, never remember who they were. They carved their brutality into stone reliefs and bragged about it. Cities burned, prisoners impaled, whole populations vanishing off the map. That was the shadow now falling over the northern kingdom, and into that shadow stepped the last king Israel would ever have. His name was Hosea. He came to power the way so many before him had, by murdering the king ahead of him. And he inherited a kingdom that was already paying protection money to Assyria just to be left alone, year after year, a heavy tribute of silver handed over to keep the war machine at bay. Then Hosea made the gamble that ended everything. He decided to stop paying. He had heard whispers of help from Egypt to the south. So he secretly sent messengers to the Egyptian pharaoh looking for an ally, and he shut off the tribute to Assyria. He bet the entire kingdom on Egypt showing up. Egypt did not show up. Egypt almost never showed up. The prophets had been warning for years that leaning on Egypt was like leaning on a broken reed that runs into your hand and pierces it. Hosea leaned. The reed broke. The Assyrian king came with his army and did not stop. He seized Hosea and threw him in prison, and then he laid siege to Samaria, the capital Omri had built on its beautiful hill. And the siege did not last a week or a month. It lasted 3 years. 3 years of a city sealed off, slowly starving behind its own walls, waiting for a rescue that was never coming. Then, in the year 722 before Christ, the walls came down, and the northern kingdom of Israel simply ceased to exist. The Assyrians did what the Assyrians did. They took the survivors, the 10 tribes, the descendants of the men who had walked out shouting, "To your tents, O Israel," 2 centuries earlier, and they deported them. Marched them off into the Assyrian Empire and scattered them so thoroughly that they never came back. Not as a nation, not as tribes. They dissolved into history. To this day, people call them the 10 lost tribes, and they were lost right here, on this hill, in this year. And now watch what the record keeper does, because it is the most important sentence in this entire half of the story. He stops. He puts down the list of kings. And for one long, unusual passage, he explains why. And this occurred, he writes, because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God. Then he lays it all out. The calves, the high places, the idols, the ignored prophets, king after king walking in the way of Jeroboam. 200 years of the scorecard, and this is the total at the bottom of the page. The nation did not fall because Assyria was strong. Plenty of strong empires never touched them. It fell because it had spent 2 centuries answering God's patience with the same sin, and the patience finally reached its end. Here is the detail I want you to hold, because it changes how you hear everything that comes next. The north fell in 722. But the south, Judah, did not fall with it. Judah would keep going for another 136 years, more than a century longer. Why? The 2 kingdoms had almost the same sins, almost the same idols, almost the same parade of failed kings. So why did one fall 136 years before the other? There is only one difference between them, and it is not a better army, or a wiser people, or a stronger economy. It is a promise made to a dead man named David, that his lamp would not go out in Jerusalem. The north had kings. The south had a covenant. And a covenant, it turns out, buys you time that nothing else in the world can buy. So while the north dissolves into the Assyrian dust, turn your eyes south. Because Judah's story is not simpler. It is stranger. And its darkest hour has a woman at the center of it. Here is the first thing to know about the south. The list is not all darkness. Judah actually produced good kings, real ones, men who earned that rare word yasher, straight, upright in the eyes of the Lord. And you have probably never heard their names. Take Asa. He came to the throne of Judah and looked around at the idols his own family had allowed, and he tore them down. He smashed the pagan altars. He drove out the shrine prostitutes. And then he did something that must have cost him more than all the rest. He removed his own grandmother from her position as Queen Mother because she had made a disgusting idol to a fertility goddess. His own grandmother. When the choice came down to family loyalty or loyalty to God, Asa chose God, and the record calls him a king who did right all his days. Then came his son Jehoshaphat, and he did something no king before him had thought to do. He realized the people kept failing because they simply did not know God's law. Nobody had ever taught them. So Jehoshaphat sent officials and priests out on a circuit through every town in Judah, carrying the book of the law, teaching ordinary people what God had actually said. He tried to fix the problem at the root, and the South, for a generation, breathed. So understand, the South had every chance. It had good kings. It had the temple. It had the law being read in its towns. It had the promise to David running underneath all of it. Which is exactly what makes what happened next so hard to watch. Because the poison of the North had already crossed the border. Years earlier, in a moment that seemed like wise politics, a king of Judah had married his son to a princess from the north, to a daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. Her name was Athaliah, and she carried her mother's spirit south into the house of David like a slow-acting venom. For years she was just the king's wife, then the king's mother. But then her son, the king of Judah, was killed. And in the space it took for that news to travel through the palace, Athaliah did the coldest thing in the entire list of 42. She decided that, if she could not rule through her son, she would rule alone. And the only thing standing between her and the throne was her own family, the royal heirs, the sons of the king, her own grandchildren. So she gave the order to kill them, all of them, every living heir to the throne of David, murdered on the command of their own grandmother, so that one woman from the house of Ahab could sit on the throne of Judah. Now stop and feel the weight of this, because it is bigger than a palace murder. This is not a story about one cruel woman. This is not a story about a coup. This is not a story about the throne of a small kingdom. This is the single moment where the entire promise of God nearly went out like a candle. Because God had sworn to David that his line would never fail, that from his house would come a king whose throne would last forever. And here, in one afternoon of blood, the whole line of David is being wiped off the earth by a daughter of Jezebel. If she succeeds, there is no line, no lamp in Jerusalem, no future son of David, and no Christmas 2,600 years later, because there is no house of David left for a baby to be born into. And this is where it gets remarkable, because in the middle of the slaughter, one woman moved. The king's sister, a woman named Jehoshaphat, married to the priest. As the killers went room to room, she snatched one baby out of the nursery, a little boy named Josh, barely a year old, and she hid him and his nurse in a bedroom, and then in the temple of the Lord itself. And there, in the house of God, behind the walls of the very building that pointed to the promise, that one baby stayed hidden for 6 years, while his murderous grandmother sat on the throne and never knew he was alive. 6 years the promise of God survived, as a secret in a back room of the temple. The entire future of the line of David, the entire road to Bethlehem, hanging on one hidden child and one brave aunt who would not let the light go out. And in the 7th year, the priest brought the boy out. He had planned it like a military operation, positioning armed guards through the temple courts, and then he brought the child into the light in front of them all. They crowned a 7-year-old in the temple courts, put a copy of the law in his hands, anointed his head. The soldiers surrounded him, and they raised the shout, "Long live the king!" Athaliah heard the noise from the palace, came running toward the temple, and saw the impossible, a boy standing by the pillar with a crown on his head, the whole crowd rejoicing, trumpets blowing. She tore her robes and screamed the one word she had spent 6 years trying to prevent. Treason! Treason! It was the last word she ever spoke. They took her out of the house of God and ended her reign where it belonged. The house of Ahab was finished in the south at last. and the lamp of David, so nearly snuffed out, that only one hidden child stood between the promise and the dark, was burning again, held in the small hands of a boy who had spent his entire life hidden inside the house of God. The boy Josh grew up and reigned, and foray, while he did right, as long as the priest who saved him was alive to guide him. But even he drifted at the end. That is the pattern in the South too. A good start, a slow fade. Kings came and went, some straight, most crooked, and the scorecard kept its steady drumbeat. Until one king rose in Judah, who was different from almost everyone before him. His name was Hezekiah, and of him the record says something it says about almost no one else. There was no king like him among all the kings of Judah, either before or after. Hezekiah did not do reform halfway. He reopened the temple his father had shut and let fall into filth. He smashed the pagan altars and the sacred pillars. And then he did the one thing even the good kings had always been too afraid to touch. He tore down the high places, the local hilltop shrines, where people had mixed the worship of God with the worship of anything else for generations. He even destroyed a bronze snake, a relic from the days of Moses, because the people had started burning incense to it. 400 years of accumulated compromise, and Hezekiah took an axe to all of it. The record simply says, he trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was none like him. And then, that trust got tested the way faith always eventually gets tested, with a real enemy at the gate. The same Assyrian war machine that had erased the northern kingdom now turned south. Their new king, Sennacherib, swept through Judah's fortified cities one after another, 46 of them, and finally arrived at the walls of Jerusalem, with an army that had never lost. He surrounded the city, and then he did something clever. He sent his field commander to stand within earshot of the walls and shout, in the local language, so every soldier and citizen could hear, a speech designed to break their spirit. "Where are the gods of the other nations we destroyed?" He called out. "Did any of them save their people from us? Do not let your Hezekiah fool you. Do not let him tell you the Lord will deliver you. No God has ever stopped us. Yours will not either. Pay attention to this, because it is the whole hinge of the story. That taunt was not really aimed at the city. It was aimed at God. Sennacherib had just put the living God on the same shelf as the wooden idols of every nation he had already crushed. Hezekiah did the one thing a king was supposed to do, and almost never did. He took the threatening letter from the Assyrians, and he walked into the temple, and he spread it out open before the Lord. And he prayed. He did not pray for his reputation. He prayed, in effect, this: Lord, it is true, these kings have destroyed all those nations, because those were only wood and stone, the work of human hands. But you are the living God. Save us, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are God. And God answered, through the prophet Isaiah, with a promise so bold it sounds reckless. Sennacherib will not shoot an arrow into this city. He will not build a siege ramp against it. He will go home the way he came. I will defend this city for my own sake, and for the sake of David my servant. For the sake of David. There it is again, the dead man's name, still buying the living their salvation. And then the record tells it in a single, staggering verse. That night, the angel of the Lord went out and struck the Assyrian camp. And when the people of Jerusalem woke up in the morning and looked out over the walls, the army that had never lost was a field of bodies. 185,000 of them. Sennacherib, the king who had mocked the living God, broke camp with what was left, turned around, and marched home in humiliation. And some time later, back in his own capital, in the temple of his own God, his own sons murdered him with the sword. The God he trusted could not even save him inside his own house. Now here is where it gets remarkable, because we can actually check this one. Archaeologists found Sennacherib's own account of this campaign, carved into a clay prism now sitting in a museum. And Sennacherib brags about Judah. He brags that he shut up King Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. But read carefully what the great conqueror, who recorded every city he ever took, does not say. He never says he took Jerusalem. The king who listed every victory in stone went strangely silent about the one city he surrounded and could not break. The bird, somehow, was still in the cage and still singing. Even Assyria's own stone confirms the Bible's account by what it refuses to claim. Hezekiah had trusted, and Jerusalem stood. But Hezekiah had a son, and the son would undo almost all of it. His name was Manasseh, and he is the hardest king in the whole list to explain because of who his father was. Think about it. Hezekiah was the best king Judah had seen in centuries. He tore down the high places. He trusted God, with an army at his gate, and watched 185,000 enemies fall in a night. His son grew up inside that house, with that father, hearing those stories firsthand. If ever a boy was set up to be faithful, it was this one. And Manasseh became the most evil king in the entire history of the South. He did not just neglect God. He went to war against everything his father built, brick by brick, as if he were trying to erase the man. Hezekiah tore down the high places, Manasseh rebuilt them. Hezekiah smashed the altars to Baal, Manasseh raised them again. Then he went further than any king before him had dared. He built altars to the stars inside the temple itself, in the house of the living God. He practiced sorcery and consulted mediums. And the record says a thing, so dark it is hard to read aloud. He sacrificed his own son in the fire. The great-great-grandson of David burned a child to a foreign god in the shadow of God's own temple. The record keeper adds one more line about him, and it is one of the most chilling in Scripture. Manasseh shed innocent blood very much, till he had filled Jerusalem, from one end to another. An old tradition says that among the innocents he killed was the prophet Isaiah, the same Isaiah who had comforted his father, sawn in two on Manasseh's order. And this king, this monster, reigned for 55 years, longer than any king of Judah, north or south, in the entire book. The worst of them all got the longest reign of them all. Now I have to stop here, because if you are a parent, this one lands somewhere tender, and I do not want to rush past it. Hezekiah did everything right, and his son turned out to be the worst of them all. You can be faithful, you can build the right thing, you can pour your whole life into raising someone toward the light, and still watch them walk into the dark. That is one of the most honest and painful things this whole list admits. Faithfulness is not a machine that produces faithful children. And if that is your ache tonight, watching someone you raised walk a road you would give anything to pull them off of, this ancient story sees you. Hold that thought, because it is going to matter enormously in a few minutes, and it is the exact place this whole story is heading. And while you are holding it, let me ask you for one thing, since you have come this far with me. If any of these kings has stayed with you, Hezekiah at the wall, or this father and son collapse, take 1 second to share this with the one person you know who loves the hard, honest parts of the Bible, not just the tidy ones. This is the half nobody teaches. Someone in your life needs to see how the story actually turns. Because here is what almost no one tells you about Manasseh, the monster with the 55-year reign. It does not end where you think. Late in his life, the Assyrians came and dragged him off in bronze shackles, a hook in his nose, to Babylon. And there, in a foreign prison, the most evil king in the history of Judah did the one thing almost none of them ever did. He broke. The record says that in his distress he humbled himself greatly and cried out to the God of his fathers, and that God, unbelievably, heard him and brought him home, and Manasseh spent his last years tearing down the very altars he had spent a lifetime building. Even the worst of them was not past the reach of a God who keeps the light on. Keep that in your chest. Because the last chapter of this story is about a prison and a king and a light that would not go out, and Manasseh is the quiet rehearsal for it. But before we get to that prison, there is one more king to meet, the best one left, and he is only 8 years old. His name was Josiah, and he became king of Judah at 8 years old. Picture that, a child on the throne of David, in a kingdom that his grandfather Manasseh had soaked in idolatry and innocent blood for half a century. Josiah grew up surrounded by the wreckage of the worst reign in the nation's history. The temple was neglected. The law of God had been ignored for so long that, as we are about to see, it had literally gone missing. This was the world handed to an 8-year-old. And somehow, against all of it, the boy turned toward God. The record says that while he was still young, still a teenager, he began to seek the God of his father David. Not the God of his grandfather. The God of David, reaching back over the ruin of 2 generations to grab hold of the oldest and truest thing in his family. Then, when Josiah was 26, something happened that changed the last good chapter of this story. He gave the order to repair the temple, to clean out the house of God that had sat neglected through the dark years. And while the workers were clearing out the accumulated filth and rubble, the high priest found something buried in the mess. A scroll. He came to the king's secretary and said the words, "That should stop you cold. I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord." Sit with how bad that is. They found God's law in God's temple by accident while cleaning. The word of God had been lost inside the very building built to house it, buried so deep under generations of neglect that discovering it was a surprise. That is how far the nation had drifted, not fighting God's word, just quietly losing it under the clutter until nobody even remembered it was gone. They brought the scroll to the king and read it aloud to him. And here is the difference between Josiah and almost every king before him. When Josiah heard the words of the law, heard what God had actually required, and how far the nation had fallen from it, and what was coming, as a result, he tore his robes. He did not get defensive. He did not explain it away. He did not order the scroll reburied, so he could keep ruling in comfort. He heard the weight of it, and he broke, right there on the throne. There is a Hebrew word for what Josiah did next. Shove. It means to turn, to return, to come all the way back around. It is the word the prophets had been begging every king to hear for 400 years, and the word almost none of them ever obeyed. 42 kings. And you can count on one hand the ones who truly shove, who turned back with everything in them. Josiah is the last and greatest of them. The record says it plainly. Before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart, and with all his soul, and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses. Nor did any like him arise after him. Before him, none like him. After him, none like him. Josiah is the last light. And he burned bright. He launched the most thorough reform the nation had ever seen. He tore down everything. The high places, the star altars his grandfather built, the shrines that had stood since the days of Solomon. He went north into the emptied land, where the 10 tribes used to be, and he tore down the altar at Bethel itself, the very altar where the first Jeroboam had set up a golden calf 6 centuries earlier. He reached all the way back to the original sin of the north and pulled it out by the root. Then he gathered the whole nation and read them the recovered law, out loud, from beginning to end, and led them in renewing their covenant with God. And then he held a Passover unlike any the nation had seen in living memory. The record says there had been no Passover kept like it since the days of the judges, back before there were any kings at all. For one shining generation, Judah remembered who it was. But here is the heartbreak buried inside the greatest reform in the book. God had already heard the verdict on the nation. The centuries of the scorecard had reached their total. And so, even to Josiah, the prophets brought a hard word, that because of everything Manasseh had done, everything the nation had piled up, over 400 years, the judgment was still coming. It would not come in Josiah's own days, because his heart was tender, but it would come. One good king cannot undo 400 years in a single lifetime. Josiah bought his people time and light and one last chance to remember, and then he died in battle, and the light went with him. And after Josiah, there is nothing left to stop the dark. For kings, and then the end. After Josiah, the end comes fast, and it comes ugly. For kings in about 22 years, and not one of them worth the crown. The first was deposed by Egypt after 3 months, and dragged off to die in a foreign land. The next spent 11 years playing a losing game between Egypt and the rising new superpower, Babylon, and died with the enemy closing in. Babylon had replaced Assyria now as the war machine of the world, and its king, Nebuchadnezzar, had his eyes fixed on Jerusalem. Then came a young king named Jehoiakim, and I need you to hold on to him, because he is the empty throne we left in Babylon at the very beginning of all this. Remember? The man in the prison cell, who had forgotten what a table felt like. This is him. Jehoiakim came to the throne as a teenager, 18 years old, and reigned exactly 3 months and 10 days before Nebuchadnezzar's army surrounded the city. And this young king did the one thing that, strange as it sounds, may have been the wisest thing any of these final kings did. He surrendered. He walked out and gave himself up. And Babylon took him, and his mother, and the craftsmen, and the treasures of the temple, and carried them all off to Babylon in the first great deportation. Jehoiakim, a teenager, vanished into a Babylonian prison, and there he sat for 37 years. Babylon put one last king on the throne in Jerusalem, a puppet, Josiah's own son, and renamed him Zedekiah. And Zedekiah is the final king to sit on the throne of David in Jerusalem. He was weak, and he was faithless, and after 9 years he made the fatal mistake. He rebelled against Babylon, and bet, once again, on Egypt. So Nebuchadnezzar came back, and this time he came to finish it. He threw a siege around Jerusalem. That lasted 1.5 years. Inside the walls, the horror is almost unspeakable. The famine grew, so severe that the Book of Lamentations says mothers who had loved their children could no longer feed them. For 18 months the holy city starved behind its walls, exactly as Samaria had 136 years before. The south had simply been given more time. The time was now spent. When the walls finally broke, Zedekiah tried to run. They caught him on the plains of Jericho, and they brought him to Nebuchadnezzar for sentencing. And what they did to him is the darkest single image in the entire list of 42 kings. They killed his sons in front of him. They made the last king of Judah watch every one of his boys die. And the text is deliberate and terrible about the order of this, then they put out his eyes, so that the murder of his sons would be the last thing Zedekiah ever saw. The final image burned into the mind of the final king of David's line, his children dying, and then darkness, and then chains, and Babylon. And then they burned it, the temple that Solomon built, the house where the glory of God had come down, where the ark had rested, where the boy Josh had hidden, where Josiah's lost scroll had been found. They burned it to the ground, tore down the walls of Jerusalem, and carried the people into exile. In the year 586 before Christ, the kingdom of David was over. 42 kings, for 100 years, and it ends in ash and blindness and chains. That is where the story should end. A closed book, a deadline, a promise to David that looks, from the smoke of Jerusalem, like it failed. But do you remember the empty throne? Do you remember the man in the prison who had forgotten what a table felt like? Here is where it gets remarkable, and here is the last thing the Bible says about these 42 kings, and it is not what you would expect. Turn to the very last paragraph of the book of Kings. The whole nation is in exile. Everything is lost. And then, almost as a whisper, the record tells us this. In the 37th year of Jehoiakim's imprisonment, a new king came to power in Babylon. And that king reached down into the prison, and he lifted Jehoiakim up, and he spoke kindly to him, and he took the prison clothes off him, and he gave him a seat, a throne, above the other kings who were with him in Babylon. And Jehoiakim ate at the king's table every day for the rest of his life. The empty throne was not empty forever. The king came out of the prison. The chains came off, and a son of David sat down at a king's table and ate, as an honored guest, in the middle of the exile, when every reason for hope had already burned. And we can touch this one. Archaeologists digging in the ruins of Babylon found administrative tablets, ration records, listing the food allotted from the royal stores. And there, in the clay, in the Babylonian bureaucracy's own accounting, is a name. Jehoiakim, king of the land of Judah. Rations of oil and grain for the king of Judah and his sons. The prison-to-table verse has a receipt, baked in clay, sitting in a museum. It happened. Now, why does the book end there? On a small mercy to a forgotten king? Because it is the flicker of the promise refusing to die. A prophet named Jeremiah had once cursed this very Jehoiakim. "Write this man down as childless," he said. "None of his offspring will sit on David's throne." And it looked true. The throne was gone. But God had made a promise to a dead man named David, and God does not break his word even when every king has broken theirs. So turn to the very first page of the New Testament, the genealogy of Jesus, and read the names, Josiah, and then, right there in the list, Jehoiakim, the childless king. The line ran straight through the man in the Babylonian prison, down through the generations, to a carpenter named Joseph, and to a baby laid in a manger in the town of David, called Bethlehem. The throne was never truly empty. The lamp of David never truly went out. It just went underground, through a prison and an exile, and came up in a stable 6 centuries later. And if you have ever loved someone who walked into the dark, a child, a parent, anyone you would give anything to bring home, this is the God you are looking at. The Father who watched 42 kings break his heart and kept his word anyway. The one who leaves the porch light burning through the whole long night for a family that keeps walking away because he made a promise and he intends to keep it, even if he has to reach all the way down into a prison to do it. So we have walked the whole list, 42 kings, for 100 years. And before you go, let me leave you with 3 things to carry out of it. The first is simple, and it is the point the whole Bible is quietly making through this long, grinding list. No human king could carry the weight. Not the wisest one, Solomon. Not the bravest one, Hezekiah. Not the most tender-hearted one, Josiah. Give a man a crown, and even the best of them cracks under it eventually. 42 attempts to find one king who could be trusted with the throne, and 42 times the answer came back the same. It was never going to be one of them. The whole list is a 400-year argument that humanity needed a different kind of king entirely. The second one is more personal, and you may not want to hear it, so I will say it gently. That scorecard, R.A., evil, or Yasher, straight, is not just an ancient record of dead kings. It is honest about you too. Every one of us is running our own list, our own long record of the times we walked in the way of the calf we would not let go of. And the terrifying, wonderful truth of this story is that the God who kept that honest scorecard is the same God who reached into a prison to lift a broken king to his table. He tells the truth about you, and he keeps the light on anyway, both, at the same time. And the third one is the one I actually want you to fall asleep thinking about tonight. The throne was never empty. When the smoke cleared over Jerusalem and every king had failed, and the line of David looked dead in the ash, the promise was still alive, hidden, moving underground through a prison cell in Babylon, waiting 600 years to be born in a stable. Every king on that list failed you, and there was always, from the very beginning, one more king coming, who would not. The list of 42 failures exists to make you long for the 43rd name, the one that is not in the book of Kings at all, but in the manger at the end of the genealogy. The king who kept every word the other 42 broke. So let me ask you, which king stayed with you the most? Was it the monster, Manasseh, who got 55 years and a prison repentance? Or the boy, Josiah, who found the scroll and wept? Tell me down in the comments. I read every one. 42 kings tried to sit on the throne of David. Every one of them died, and the throne outlived them all, because it was never really waiting for them. It was waiting for the child of Bethlehem, and the light he carries has never, not once in all the long dark, gone out.